Park your things and leave. This isn't your house anymore." The words cut sharper than any blade. Daniel, my only son, the boy I raised with sleepless nights and aching hands, stood in front of me with a stranger's voice. Cold, firm, distant. His eyes didn't carry the warmth I once knew. Instead, they carried a greed that chilled me to the bone. If you're just tuning to this channel, please subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. I clutched the box of my late husband's shirts tighter against my chest. The fabric still smelled faintly of Robert, my partner of 45 years, the man who had once filled this home with laughter. That house on Willow Lane wasn't just walls and bricks. It was birthdays, Christmas mornings, first steps, and last goodbyes. It was my life. But to Daniel, it was nothing more than an asset. He had inherited $42 million, and suddenly, his heart had no room left for me. My son, my flesh and blood, had chosen money over his mother. The silence that followed was heavier than words. He didn't look back, didn't flinch as he told me to leave. All I saw was Walter, the smooth-talking advisor, standing at his side, whispering into his ear like a poisonous echo. At 72, I had thought betrayal couldn't surprise me anymore. But this was worse than death. This was my son burying me alive with nothing more than his pride and a pile of cash. What would you do if the very child you raised turned on you for money? Would you fight back, or would you walk away and let them learn the hard way? Greed can tear through families faster than fire through dry wood. Have you ever seen it happen, where an inheritance, a property, or even a small sum of cash split loved ones apart? Has it happened in your family, or to someone you know? That sting of betrayal doesn't just bruise the heart, it crushes it. Daniel had once promised me the world. When he first heard of the inheritance, he swore I would never lack anything. He said I'd live out my final years in comfort, free from worry. But promises made in excitement don't always survive the test of wealth. With Walter constantly in his ear, Daniel began to see me as a burden, an obstacle in the way of investments and a lavish lifestyle. I wasn't just losing a house. I was losing my son piece by piece, to the poison of money and the grip of a man who knew how to exploit weakness. But here's the truth. What Daniel didn't realize that day was this. Wealth can vanish, pride can collapse, and even the strongest arrogance can bend. 1 week later, he would be on his knees at my door. I walked out of that house with my dignity clinging by a thread. The same walls that had sheltered my laughter, my tears, and my entire life as a mother no longer welcomed me. My son's voice still rang in my ears, flat, cold, final. For the first time in 72 years, I felt like a stranger in my own home. That night, I sat alone with nothing but a suitcase and my thoughts. I kept asking myself, how did it come to this? How did the boy I once cradled, the man I had defended against the world, decide that I was disposable? The answer, I would soon discover, was more complicated than simple greed. There were secrets buried in our family, choices hidden by time, and a man named Walter pulling strings that should never have been touched. If you're just joining this story, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're lessons about life, trust, and the price of betrayal. Because as broken as I felt that night, fate was already moving. Within 1 week, my son, the same man who cast me out, would return, not with arrogance, but with tears, shame, and desperate apologies, right at my doorstep. And that is where my story truly begins. My name is Margaret, though most people simply call me Maggie. At 72, I thought my battles with hardship were behind me. I had buried my husband Robert years earlier, and though the grief never left, I learned to live with it. He was my anchor, the man who made a modest life feel rich with meaning. Together, we raised our son Daniel in a quiet suburb on Willow Lane in Seattle. The house on Willow Lane wasn't just a structure, it was Robert's gift to our family. When Daniel turned 21, Robert used part of his trust fund to buy the house, believing it would one day give his son stability. For decades, that home became our center of gravity. It was where I cooked meals that filled every corner with warmth, where Daniel played in the backyard until the streetlights came on, and where Robert and I sat by the window every evening to watch the sun disappear over the trees. That house wasn't just Daniel's by law. It was mine by heart. After Robert passed, the walls seemed quieter, lonelier, but Daniel's presence was my comfort. He had grown into a man, with a wife named Lena and 2 children of his own. They lived a few towns over, yet he often promised that no matter what happened, I would never face the world alone. For a while, I believed him. I clung to the idea that the values we had raised him with, loyalty, gratitude, and family, would always anchor him. I didn't know then how fragile those promises would become when tested by the weight of sudden wealth. The shift began with a single phone call. Daniel's grandfather, Mr. Caldwell, had passed away. He was Robert's father, a man of quiet dignity who lived like a humble farmer. For as long as I knew him, he wore the same old hat, drove the same truck, and never gave away the fact that he had wealth. When the will was read, jaws dropped. He had left his entire fortune, $42 million, to Daniel. Not to the extended relatives, not divided among cousins or charities. Every cent was to go to my son. At first, it felt like a blessing. Daniel and Lena were ecstatic. They spoke of paying off debts, setting up college funds for Mia and Luke, and even building a new home for themselves. Daniel came to me with shining eyes, promising I would never worry again. "Mom, I'll take care of you," he said, gripping my hands with enthusiasm. "I'll buy you a house in your name. You deserve it." For a few days, the joy was contagious. Friends, neighbors, even distant relatives congratulated us. It felt like life had finally given Daniel the reward he deserved. But while everyone else celebrated, a quiet unease stirred in my chest. I had lived long enough to know that sudden wealth does not always bring happiness. It can divide, corrupt, and expose weaknesses you never knew were there. I watched Daniel's laughter grow louder, his spending bolder, his words more hurried. Something in me whispered, this inheritance would not unite us, it would test us. And though I could not yet explain why, I knew the storm had only just begun. The first signs of change appeared almost overnight. Daniel, who once shopped for shirts at discount stores and drove a modest sedan, suddenly began showing up in tailored suits, gleaming watches, and polished shoes that looked like they belonged on magazine covers. He replaced his reliable old car with a brand new Ferrari that roared down the streets of Bellevue, drawing stares from every corner. At first, Lena laughed nervously about it, saying he deserved to enjoy himself. But the purchases didn't stop with clothes or cars. There were designer handbags for her, diamond earrings that sparkled too brightly under the lights, and weekends spent at exclusive resorts where the bill could have bought someone else a year's salary. Hovering around him through it all was Walter, a sharply dressed financial advisor with slick hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He seemed to appear everywhere Daniel went, whispering into his ear like a shadow. Walter spoke of investments, business ventures, and opportunities that couldn't be missed. Daniel trusted him completely. I, however, felt an uneasiness in the pit of my stomach every time I saw him. Robert had taught Daniel that money was a tool, not an identity. But under Walter's guidance, Daniel started to believe the opposite. He strutted when he walked, carried himself with arrogance, and dismissed the cautious advice of family and friends. One evening, when I reminded him to be careful, his reply struck me cold. "Don't worry, Mom. I know what I'm doing. Walter says we need to think bigger. This is just the beginning." It was at that moment I realized I was no longer looking at the son I raised. I was looking at someone reshaped by wealth and guided by a man I didn't trust. The more Daniel flaunted his wealth, the more unsettled I became. At family dinners, he spoke less about his children's schoolwork and more about the stock market, foreign properties, and high-return opportunities. His laughter had changed too, louder, but hollow, as if it needed to prove something. Lena tried to keep the family grounded. She still cooked the same meals, still called me to check in, but even she seemed swept up in the new life. Expensive vacations replaced simple weekends. Expensive toys replaced thoughtful gifts. Their home began to feel less like a family space and more like a showroom. I could feel a distance growing between us, like an invisible wall building higher with every dollar Daniel spent. When I voiced my worries, he brushed me off. "Mom, you're old-fashioned. Times have changed. Walter knows how to handle things." The way he said Walter's name made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just trust, it was blind faith. I began to notice smaller details too. Late-night calls. Daniel ended abruptly when I walked into the room, the nervous tapping of his fingers, the way his eyes darted when I mentioned savings. Something was gnawing at him, though he hid it under his new polished exterior. I had seen enough of life to recognize when a person was being pulled by forces stronger than themselves. My son wasn't steering this ship anymore. He was being steered, and straight into dangerous waters. I didn't know how far things would go, but I knew this much: money had not lifted us into a better future. It had planted a poison in my son's heart. And sooner or later, that poison would turn on me. It was a quiet afternoon when Daniel arrived at the house. I had been folding Robert's old shirts, the fabric worn soft from years of use, when I heard the sound of a car door shutting outside. Through the curtain, I spotted Daniel stepping out in his press suit, and next to him stood Walter, dressed like always, his briefcase in hand and that practiced smile across his face. The moment they entered, I felt the air change. Gone was the warmth of a son visiting his mother. Instead, it felt like I was sitting across from businessmen here for a transaction. Daniel didn't hug me, didn't even ask how I was. He looked at me with a steady, expressionless stare, and my heart sank before he even spoke. "Mom," he began, his voice flat, "we need to talk about the house." I clutched Robert's shirt tighter, bracing myself. I had lived here for 45 years. Every memory of my marriage, of raising Daniel, of building a life, was tied to these walls. Walter leaned in slightly, his tone smooth. "Daniel and I have been reviewing some investment opportunities. The property market is strong, and selling this house would allow Daniel to make moves that will secure his future." Daniel nodded. "It's time to sell, Mom. We need the money for investments." The words hit like a blow. I searched his eyes for hesitation, for even a flicker of the boy I had raised, but all I saw was steel, cold, and detached. It wasn't just a house he was taking away from me. It was my past, my memories, and the last piece of Robert the first still held onto. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My lips trembled, but no words came. I stared at Daniel, hoping he would break the silence with a laugh, tell me it was all a joke, that he would never dream of casting me out. But his face didn't soften. His arms folded across his chest, and beside him, Walter watched with quiet satisfaction. "Daniel," I finally whispered, "this isn't just a house. It's our home. It's where your father carried you through the front door as a baby, where you learned to walk, where we celebrated your birthdays." He didn't answer. He shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as though he wanted this conversation over quickly. "Mom, it's not personal. It's business. Walter says it's the smart thing to do." Business. That was the word he used. As if a mother's love and 45 years of memories could be reduced to a business transaction. I felt a heaviness in my chest, a hollowness that spread through me as he turned his eyes away. For the first time, I realized I wasn't looking at my son anymore. I was looking at a stranger wearing his face, a man whose heart had been reshaped by greed. I swallowed my grief and nodded, too broken to argue. My pride would not let me beg. Carrying Robert's shirts pressed against me like a shield, I walked past Daniel and Walter without another word. The door closed behind me, and the house, my home, no longer belonged to me. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. Humiliation burned through me, not just because I had been cast aside, but because the betrayal came from the very person I had given my life to. The next 2 days passed in a blur of boxes and memories. Every item I packed carried a piece of Robert, a piece of Daniel's childhood, a piece of me. I folded away his baby clothes I had kept tucked in a drawer, wrapped the family photos in newspaper, and placed Robert's old tools in a crate. Each time I sealed a box, it felt like I was sealing away another part of my soul. The most painful moment came when I reached for Robert's winter coat. As I slid my hand into the lining to fold it, my fingers brushed against something hidden, a small pocket with a note and a key inside. I slipped them into my own pocket quietly, my mind too clouded with grief to dwell on their meaning. That discovery would later open doors I never knew existed, but in that moment, all I could think about was survival. On the morning of my departure, Daniel stood by the front door, his arms crossed. His tone was firm, final. I'm sorry, Mom, but this is for the best. The words carved deeper than any knife. There was no embrace, no attempt at comfort. Just that cold statement, as though it were a mercy to cut me away from my own life. I walked past him with my head held high, but inside I was shattered. When the taxi pulled away from Willow Lane, I pressed my forehead to the window, watching the only home I had ever known shrink into the distance. My chest ached, but no tears came. Humiliation is heavier than sorrow. It doesn't let tears fall. Before I tell you what happened after I left, let me ask you this. What would you do if your own child betrayed you like this? Comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. As I packed away Robert's winter coat for what I thought would be the last time, my fingers brushed against a seam that didn't feel right. I pressed harder and discovered a small pocket stitched into the lining. Inside, I found a folded piece of paper and a tiny silver key with a heart-shaped charm dangling from it. The handwriting on the note was Robert's. It listed an address in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a place I had never once heard him mention. My breath caught in my throat. Why had he kept this hidden? Why had he never spoken of it, not even during his final days? I slipped the note and key into my handbag, my thoughts heavy with questions. That night, as I lay in a rented room, sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the bed frame, every tick of the clock reminded me of what I had lost. My home, my son, my sense of belonging. Yet the key pressed against my side like a calling. Robert had left me something, and I could no longer ignore it. 2 days later, I boarded a bus heading east. Each mile carried me further from Seattle, further from Daniel's betrayal, and closer to whatever truth Robert had hidden away. My reflection in the bus window looked older, wearier, but also steadier. The humiliation of being cast out was still raw, but curiosity now lit a new fire within me. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was a woman chasing an answer, even if that answer shattered everything I thought I knew about the man I had loved. Cambridge was nothing like the quiet streets of Willow Lane. The air felt brisker, the sidewalks busier, the buildings older. I clutched my handbag tightly as I stood before the brownstone listed on Robert's note. Its paint was faded, its door weathered, yet the number matched perfectly. My hands trembled as I pulled the small silver key from my pocket. It fit into the lock with an ease that startled me, as though it had been waiting all these years for this exact moment. I climbed to the 3rd floor, each step heavier than the last, until I stood before a plain door with no nameplate. When I turned the key, the door creaked open to reveal a room frozen in time. Dust lay across the furniture, but everything inside spoke of a life carefully preserved. The scent hit me first, pipe tobacco. Robert's scent. For a second, it felt as though he might step out from the shadows, smiling, ready to explain everything. But the silence was absolute. On the coffee table sat a neat bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. My knees weakened as I recognized Robert's handwriting. But the letters weren't for me. They were addressed to someone named Clara. I sank into a chair and untied the ribbon, my fingers stiff from both age and fear. Each page carried words of care, worry, and deep responsibility. Robert had been writing to a woman he called his sister. A sister I had never known existed. Grief, confusion, and suspicion tangled inside me. Robert had lived an entire secret life, and I was only just stepping into its shadows. The letters painted a story I never imagined. Clara was Robert's sister, hidden from our lives, kept away from family gatherings, never once spoken of in all the years we were married. She had been suffering from a rare illness, one that required constant care and expensive treatments. Robert had been supporting her quietly, year after year, never once burdening me with the truth. In one letter, he wrote about his struggle to keep up with the medical costs. He confessed that he had started drawing from his trust fund, siphoning money he had promised to protect for Daniel's future. His words were heavy with guilt, but also determination. If I don't help Clara, who will? She is my blood, and her suffering will not be ignored. My hands shook as I continued reading. Robert had poured millions into Clara's treatments, even establishing a new trust fund in her name to secure her future. That meant Daniel's inheritance, though still immense, was far less than what everyone believed. The fabled $42 million had been cut nearly in half. It dawned on me then why Walter's presence lingered like a shadow over Daniel's newfound wealth. Walter had known. He must have helped Robert redirect those funds. And now, instead of protecting my son, he was twisting the truth, using the incomplete inheritance to manipulate him. I pressed Robert's journal against my chest, torn between anger and sorrow. Anger that he had kept such a secret from me, sorrow that he had carried that burden alone, and fear for Daniel, who was caught in the grip of a man who held the power of lies in his hands. As I pieced together the meaning of Robert's hidden letters and journal, one name kept resurfacing: Walter. Robert had trusted him to handle the delicate arrangements of Clara's care and the secret trust fund. But where Robert had leaned on Walter out of necessity, Daniel leaned on him out of blind faith. I remembered how Walter always hovered close, whispering, calculating, making Daniel believe he was the key to multiplying his fortune. But now I saw the pattern clearly. Walter knew the truth, that Daniel hadn't inherited $42 million in untouched wealth. He knew about Clara, about the siphoned funds, about Robert's desperate measures. And he was using that knowledge to control my son. The thought chilled me. Walter wasn't advising Daniel. He was pulling his strings. Each flashy purchase, each reckless investment, each cruel word Daniel had spoken to me was a reflection of Walter's poison. And Daniel, weakened by his own insecurities and the sudden weight of wealth, couldn't see the trap tightening around him. As I sat in that quiet Cambridge apartment, surrounded by photographs of a woman I never knew and the faint scent of my late husband's tobacco, the betrayal I had felt from Daniel twisted into something more complex. My son wasn't only guilty, he was ensnared. The house on Willow Lane had been taken from me. My dignity had been crushed. But for the first time in days, I felt a new resolve burning within me. This was no longer about a home. It was about protecting my son from a man who thrived on corruption, and about unearthing every secret Robert had left behind. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was a mother on a mission. The Cambridge apartment had given me answers, but also a new kind of burden. I knew now that Robert had been keeping secrets, that Walter was no ordinary advisor, and that Daniel was drowning in a world he wasn't prepared for. The grief I felt when I lost my home began to harden into something sharper, a determination to uncover the full truth. I started small. In the drawers of the apartment, tucked between Robert's journals and Clara's letters, I found an old address book. My fingers trailed down the faded ink until I saw it: Walter's name, followed by a business address and a home number. My pulse quickened. Robert had trusted this man enough to put him in his private records. If Walter had been close enough to handle secret trust funds, then he held the answers I needed. I hesitated only briefly before making my decision. I would confront him myself. The next morning, I dressed not in morning black, but in my neatest clothes, the ones Robert always said made me look dignified. I took a taxi into Boston, my hands trembling only slightly as I gave the driver the address. The city rose around me, towering glass, busy streets, polished offices. Somewhere inside this maze sat the man who had turned my son against me. When I walked into Walter's office, the receptionist gave me a polite but puzzled smile. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," I replied firmly. "But he'll want to see me. Tell him Daniel's mother is here." Her eyebrows lifted, but after a short call, she led me through polished hallways to a door with Walter's name etched in brass. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, ready to face the man who had stolen my son's loyalty. Walter rose from behind his desk when I entered, his expression carefully arranged into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Margaret," he said smoothly, "what a surprise. To what do I owe this visit?" I met his gaze without flinching. "You know why I'm here. I've been to the Cambridge apartment. I know about Clara, and I know about the trust fund Robert built for her. You've been feeding Daniel lies. Now, I want the truth." For the first time, the practiced calm on his face faltered. A flash of irritation crossed his features, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "You think you've discovered something new? Robert and I had an arrangement. He owed me, and I collected. Your son has benefited more than you realize. Perhaps you should be grateful." He opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the desk. Inside were documents bearing Robert's signature, contracts, agreements, even acknowledgments of debt. My stomach twisted as I studied them. The penmanship looked flawless, but I knew better. Robert's hand had carried a slight tremor ever since his army days. These signatures were steady, too neat. They were forgeries. Walter must have read my thoughts, because his smile sharpened. Careful, Margaret. Accusing me without proof could end very badly for your family. I know more about Daniel than you do. For instance, his gambling problem. Did he tell you about that? No. He's been in over his head for years. Debts, late-night calls, risky bets. If I wanted, I could ruin him in a day. The words landed like stones in my chest. My son, my Daniel, addicted to gambling? The signs I had brushed aside now replayed in painful clarity. Walter leaned closer, his voice a hiss. So you see, Margaret, you should tread lightly. You don't want the world to know what kind of man your son really is. Walter's words echoed in my ears long after I left his office. Gambling. Debts. Desperation. I replayed every recent conversation with Daniel, every late-night call he had cut short, every restless glance and sharp mood swing I had brushed aside. The truth was unbearable. I had been so lost in my own grief that I hadn't seen my son struggle. The shame of it pressed down on me heavier than the betrayal itself. I had thought Daniel's cruelty was born purely from greed, but now I saw a more fragile truth. He was weak, cornered by temptation, and Walter had pounced on that weakness like a predator. My son wasn't just reckless, he was trapped. I sat alone that evening in the Cambridge apartment, Robert's journal open on my lap, tears sliding silently down my face. I had always believed my role as a mother was finished when Daniel became a man, but I was wrong. Motherhood doesn't end when children grow tall, it simply changes form. I had failed to see what he was hiding, and now that failure had left him vulnerable to a man like Walter. But grief and guilt would not be the end of me. As I wiped my tears, I felt a quiet resolve rise in their place. I had lost my home, my trust, even my peace, but I would not lose my son without a fight. Walter thought age made me powerless. He thought betrayal had broken me beyond repair. But he was wrong. I was Margaret Caldwell. I had survived widowhood, humiliation, and heartbreak. Now I would take on deception itself. The next morning, I woke with a clear purpose. Walter believed his threats would silence me, but they had only sharpened my determination. If he was forging documents and preying on Daniel's weakness, then I needed evidence strong enough to expose him. I returned to Robert's hidden apartment and began combing through every box, every drawer, every folder. Robert had left traces of himself everywhere, scribbled notes, old receipts, even pages of his uneven handwriting. That handwriting was my weapon. If Walter had truly forged those documents, then Robert's natural script, with its unmistakable tremor, would be the key to proving it. Hours passed as I spread papers across the floor, comparing signatures, circling inconsistencies. The more I looked, the clearer it became Walter's agreements were too perfect, too polished. Robert's true hand wavered slightly, revealing the truth of a man whose body carried old scars. But gathering proof wasn't enough. Walter was clever, slippery, and ruthless. If I confronted him again without backup, he would twist the story until I looked like the madwoman. I needed someone he couldn't intimidate, someone who understood the law better than he did. Arthur came to mind. He had been Robert's closest friend and Daniel's godfather, a retired lawyer with a fierce sense of justice. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but if anyone could help me take on Walter, it was Arthur. That night, I called him. My voice shook as I explained everything. Daniel's betrayal, the forged documents, the gambling, and Clara's hidden trust. When I finished, there was silence on the other end. Then Arthur's steady voice cut through. Maggie, you can't let this man destroy your family. Gather everything you have. We'll expose him together. For the first time since losing my home, I felt a glimmer of strength. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. Arthur arrived at the Cambridge apartment 2 days later, carrying the kind of presence that reminded me why Robert had trusted him for decades. His shoulders were stooped with age, but his eyes were sharp, and when I handed him the bundle of forged documents alongside Robert's journals, he studied them with quiet intensity. After several minutes, he looked up. "You're right, Maggie. These aren't authentic." Robert's real hand shows a tremor, a slight shake on every loop and curve. "These signatures are too smooth. Too perfect." Walter forged them. Relief and fear clashed inside me. I finally had confirmation, but I also knew what it meant. Walter wasn't just a manipulator, he was a criminal. As we continued to sift through Robert's belongings, Arthur found something I had overlooked, a letter from a Zurich clinic confirming Clara's long-term treatment. Attached was a record of financial transfers from Robert's accounts. The amounts were staggering. Millions moved over the years to pay for her care. And tucked at the back was another letter, this one recent, warning that someone else had tried to claim authority over Clara's trust. The name listed was Daniel Caldwell. But it wasn't Daniel. Arthur's brow furrowed as he tapped the paper. "This is Walter. He's been posing as Daniel to get access to Clara's trust fund. If he succeeds, he won't just ruin your son. He'll leave a sick woman destitute." Horror surged through me. Walter wasn't satisfied with bleeding my son dry. He was reaching across borders to drain what Robert had built for his sister's survival. Arthur closed the file firmly. "It's time, Maggie. We need to set a trap. And Daniel needs to hear the truth directly from us." Arthur wasted no time. "We'll never outwit Walter by going at him directly," he explained, his voice steady. "But Daniel is the key. Walter has him wrapped in lies. But if we show Daniel the truth, his entire grip collapses." The plan was simple. Bring Daniel to a neutral place, put the evidence in front of him, and make him choose. Arthur suggested a quiet cafe in downtown Seattle, the kind of place where conversations could unfold without interruptions. I hesitated. A part of me still ached from the memory of Daniel standing at my doorway, coldly telling me to leave. The thought of facing him again made my chest tighten. But Arthur pressed a reassuring hand on mine. "You're not going in as a victim this time, Maggie. You're going in as a mother fighting for her son." I called Daniel the next morning. My voice shook slightly, but I held firm. "Daniel, I need to see you. It's important. Meet me tomorrow at the Maple Street Cafe." There was a pause. Then his voice came, clipped and cautious. "Is this about the house again?" Because Walter already explained. "It's not about the house," I interrupted. "It's about your father. And it's about you." Another pause. Then, reluctantly, he agreed. The following day, Arthur and I arrived early, a small briefcase full of documents between us. I watched through the window as Daniel and Lena walked up the sidewalk. He looked uneasy, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting nervously as though already bracing for battle. When he entered and sat across from us, I saw not the boy I raised, but a man hollowed out by fear. The moment had come to show him the truth. The cafe was nearly empty, the hum of the espresso machine filling the silence between us. Daniel's hands tapped restlessly against the table, his eyes flicking toward the door as if he longed to escape. Lena sat beside him, her face pale, her hand resting over his in quiet support. Arthur began, his tone measured and firm. "Daniel, your father trusted me as both a friend and a lawyer. I've seen his records, his journals, his real signature. And I've seen the forgeries Walter has placed in your hands." Daniel stiffened. "Forgeries?" "Walter told me those papers were binding. He said Dad owed him money, that the will was airtight." I slid Robert's journal across the table. "Look at this, Daniel. Look at your father's true signature. Notice the shake in his hand. He had it for years. The documents Walter showed you don't have it. They're fake." He frowned, glancing between the journal and the folder of so-called contracts Walter had given him. His hands trembled as the differences became clear. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He wouldn't. He couldn't." Arthur leaned forward. "He didn't. Walter forged them to control you. And it goes further. He's been trying to claim Clara's trust fund too, posing as you. If he succeeds, you'll be left with nothing, and your father's sick sister will be left with even less." The color drained from Daniel's face. He buried his head in his hands, his body shaking. He told me if I didn't do what he said, he'd tell everyone about the gambling. He said he'd ruin me. His words broke into sobs. I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was hurt you, Mom. My chest ached at the sight of my son unraveling before me. Betrayal had cut me deeply, but seeing his shame was almost harder to bear. Daniel's sobs filled the quiet cafe, each one cutting through the distance that had grown between us. He lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen, his voice breaking. I betrayed you, Mom. I let him convince me you were in the way. I was so blinded by fear, by greed, that I turned my back on you. I don't deserve forgiveness. I reached across the table, my hand covering his. You're my son. I raised you, I know your heart. Yes, you failed me, but you were preyed upon. Walter used your weakness against you. This isn't just your shame, it's his crime. Lena pressed closer to him, her face wet with tears. Arthur cleared his throat, steady as ever. Daniel, this doesn't end with regret. You have a choice now. Work with us. Expose Walter. He's left a trail of forged documents, false claims, and manipulations. Together, we can bring him down. Daniel swallowed hard, his breathing uneven. Then slowly he nodded. I'll do it. Whatever it takes. I'll make it right. For the first time since losing my home, I felt a flicker of hope. My son was still in there, the boy I had raised, hidden under layers of fear and lies. This moment wasn't about money, or even the house. It was about family, about reclaiming the bond Walter had tried to shatter. I squeezed Daniel's hand. You're not alone anymore. We'll face this together. Turning back to the camera of this story, I say this to you watching. If you're with me so far, hit the like button. It helps us share more of these life-changing stories. The trap was set. Walter thought he had us cornered, but he had underestimated a mother's resolve, a godfather's loyalty, and a son finally ready to stand on the side of truth. The days following our meeting at the cafe were some of the hardest of Daniel's life. He carried himself like a man stripped of all pride. No suits, no flashy car, no arrogant stride. Instead, he moved with shoulders slumped, his eyes weighed down by shame. He came to me one evening, his voice low. Mom, I can't forgive myself. I let Walter poison me. I let my fear of exposure make me cruel. I turned on you, the one person who never abandoned me. His words cracked as he spoke. I don't know how to make it right. I looked at him, truly looked at him. For weeks I had only seen the stranger Walter had molded, but now the mask was gone. Before me sat the boy I had raised, the same boy who once clung to my hand on his first day of school, who once promised me he'd take care of me when I grew old. You don't erase mistakes by words alone, Daniel, I said softly. You erase them by what you do next. And so began the work of redemption. With Arthur's help, we filed the evidence. Walter's forged documents, his fraudulent claims, his attempt to impersonate Daniel to steal Clara's trust, all of it was handed to the authorities. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully, knowing that Walter's hold on my son was beginning to crumble. But Daniel's path wasn't just about exposing Walter. It was about facing his own demons and finding a way to rebuild what greed and fear had nearly destroyed. The investigation moved quickly once Arthur handed over the evidence. The forged documents were undeniable, each one a polished imitation that crumbled under expert review. Robert's real handwriting, with its distinct tremor, became the thread that unraveled Walter's web of lies. Authorities soon uncovered more. Walter had built a pattern of deception stretching back years, targeting families like ours, people who trusted him blindly. Fraud, forgery, blackmail, the list of charges grew longer with each passing day. He wasn't just an advisor gone astray. He was a predator, and now the law had caught him. When the arrest finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. Walter was led out of his sleek office in handcuffs, his polished smile gone, replaced by the hard lines of defeat. The newspapers carried the story, calling him a mastermind of financial deceit. For me, the headline didn't matter. What mattered was that his grip on Daniel was broken. The legal process that followed was painful, but it brought closure. The court acknowledged Robert's original intent, restoring the house on Willow Lane to my name. After weeks of humiliation and uncertainty, I walked once more through the front door, not as a guest, not as an intruder, but as its rightful keeper. I stood in the living room, the familiar scent of aged wood and old memories surrounding me. For the first time in months, I felt whole. This wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about reclaiming dignity, history, and the bond Robert and I had built in this home. But the victory wasn't mine alone. Daniel had begun his own journey toward redemption, and the choices he made next would determine the man he would become. Once the house was restored in my name, Daniel surprised me with a decision I hadn't expected. He came to me one evening, his expression solemn. "Mom," he said, "this house holds your memories. It's where you built your life with Dad. I don't want to take that from you again. But I also don't want to cling to money that nearly destroyed me. I've decided to sell it." The word struck me with both sorrow and relief. Part of me wanted to keep him tethered to Willow Lane, to the rooms where he once played as a boy, but I also understood what he meant. That house had been both a blessing and a burden to him. For Daniel, it represented not just family, but also the shame of betrayal and Walter's poisonous influence. The sale went through within weeks. Daniel and Lena used the money to purchase a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. Gone were the Ferraris, the designer suits, the extravagant vacations. In their place came simple furniture, a small backyard where Mia and Luke could play, and a sense of peace Daniel had long forgotten. He took steps to face his gambling addiction as well, enrolling in counseling and attending support groups. It wasn't easy. I could see the battle in his eyes. But this time, he wasn't hiding. He wanted to be better, not richer. When I visited their new home for the first time, Lena met me at the door with a smile that carried both exhaustion and hope. Inside, the children ran to me, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw my son standing tall, not because of wealth, but because of humility. It was a week after Daniel and Lena settled into their new home when I heard a knock at my door. The sound was hesitant, almost fragile. When I opened it, I found Daniel on the steps, not standing tall, not proud, but kneeling. His eyes were swollen, his cheeks streaked with tears. "Mom," he choked, his voice breaking, "I am so sorry. I don't deserve to call myself your son after the way I treated you. I let greed and fear turn me into a man I don't recognize. You gave me everything, and I gave you betrayal." I stood frozen, my heart torn between the memory of his cruelty and the sight of his brokenness now. Slowly, I bent down and lifted him to his feet. His body shook as I pulled him into my arms. "Daniel," I whispered, "you lost yourself, but you found your way back. That's what matters. I don't need wealth. I don't need grand promises. All I need is my son." In that moment, the weight of months of grief and humiliation lifted. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it built a bridge toward the future. Daniel had chosen humility over arrogance, family over fortune. Walter's schemes were finished, but our story wasn't about him anymore. It was about the strength of bonds tested by betrayal, the chance to rebuild after failure, and the truth that no fortune could replace love. As Daniel held me, I realized I hadn't just regained my home, I had regained my family. And that was worth more than $42 million could ever buy. As I sit in the quiet of my restored home, I think about how everything unfolded. $42 million. It sounds like a dream, a blessing beyond measure. Yet I watched how quickly that kind of wealth turned into poison. It didn't build my family, it nearly destroyed it. Money can open doors, yes. It can buy comfort, security, even opportunity. But left unchecked, it feeds fear, greed, and pride. I saw my son blinded by it, convinced that possessions mattered more than people. And I saw how easily a man like Walter used that blindness to twist him into someone I barely recognized. But here's the truth. This story was never about money. It was about family. It was about a mother's fight to pull her son back from the edge of ruin. Not for property, not for pride, but for love. Revenge never guided me. What drove me was something stronger, a refusal to let greed claim the last piece of my family. When Daniel knelt at my door, he didn't bring back millions. He brought back himself. And that was worth more than any fortune. Wealth fades, but bonds, when they're rebuilt with humility and forgiveness, become stronger than before. If there's one message I want you to take from my journey, it's this: Family is worth more than any amount of money. Wealth can vanish overnight, but the people who love you, those bonds you build across years of sacrifice and care, those are priceless. I lost sight of that for a time, believing my son's rejection meant the end of everything. But redemption taught me something powerful. People can fall, they can betray, they can wound us deeply, and still, they can return. Forgiveness doesn't excuse the pain, but it clears a path for healing. So I ask you, how much is your family worth? Would you let greed tear it apart, or would you fight to hold it together? Would you allow pride to push someone away, or would you choose the harder road of forgiveness? For me, the answer became clear. My son came back not with riches, but with humility. He returned not as a man of wealth, but as a man willing to rebuild. And I, in turn, had to meet him with grace. That is the only way broken families heal. To all of you watching, share this story if it touched your heart, and don't forget to subscribe for more Granny stories. Your support helps us bring more stories of betrayal, redemption, and lessons that speak to the soul. As I close this chapter of my life, I leave you with this truth. Greed destroys, but forgiveness rebuilds. Never let money weigh heavier than love. Never let pride speak louder than family. At the end of the day, houses crumble, fortunes disappear, but love, when we choose it, lasts. And that is the real inheritance.